This is Rambod Behboodi, Senior Counsel at Borden Ladner Gervais in Ottawa. I'm here with Stephen Boer, former Canadian Ambassador to the World Trade Organization. And this is the Tariff Home Companion, a new podcast to shed light, not heat, on trade and tariff issues affecting Canada and Canadians. We're back to talk trade, this time on diversification. We're joined by an eminent figure in Canadian politics and trade policy. In our first episode, we took a relatively brisk walk through the latter half of the 19th century, the explosion of trade between Canada and the United States, and the tragedy of the Civil War. We saw how trade, or lack thereof, with the United States was one of the factors spurring the British North American colonies of Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia to economic and political union. We saw the rise and then the fall of the golden age of tariffs in the United States. The new country, Canada, reacted to U.S. protectionism by putting in place in 1897 a policy of imperial preference. Other dominions followed suit, but imperial preferences, championed by the populist industrialist Joseph Chamberlain, tore the Tory party apart in the mother country. The Liberals came back into government and free trade won out for a while. Back to Canada, the United States, under President Taft, changed tack and again asked for reciprocity. The Laurier Liberals obliged. The country did not. The reciprocity election of 1911 was not just the end of Laurier, but signaled the birth, under Robert Borden, of a new Canadian national economic identity, backed by a growing sense of imperial dominion unity. Or did it? As both countries were expanding west after the first reciprocity agreement and its demise, trade had continued. As Congress found, it was a commerce of convenience. The trade did not follow the agreement. It reflected the geographic realities of the two continental countries. And so, early in the new century, we saw two currents, one economic and continental, the other, oddly, both nationalistic and imperial, and essentially nostalgic. By 1920, even though reciprocity had failed, even with imperial preferences in place, even with nascent trade agreements between Canada and a handful of other countries, the United States was Canada's largest trading partner. All good things and all that. In 1929, Wall Street crashes. A year later, the United States imposes punishing tariffs on all its trading partners. Anyone with a passing familiarity with Ferris Bueller's Day Off knows of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Building on Chamberlain's long-lost imperial preferences, the United Kingdom and the Dominions gathered in the Ottawa Conference to hammer out a new set of preferences to counteract the U.S. tariffs. And the agreement was between the UK, Canada, Australia, India, New Zealand, the Irish Free State, and the Union of South Africa. And then there was World War II. As we saw last time, the Allies established institutions to combat the economic problems that, in their view, had contributed to the global catastrophe. That's how we ended up with the World Bank, the IMF, and the GATT. Now we had a multilateral framework that governed and sought to reduce trade barriers. So far, so good. And yet, for all the disruptions to Canada-US trade after Smoot-Hawley, for all the preferences negotiated at the Ottawa Conference, for all the global institutions we'd set up, by the 1950s, that commerce of convenience was back. Canada-US trade would continue to be the economy's main driver. All the efforts to expand trade relations with other countries were at best supplementary to Canada's economic development. Enter John G. Diefenbaker. Upon taking over the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party in 1956, Diefenbaker launched a populist, nationalist, and strongly nostalgic campaign against the long-running Liberals. He promised greater domestic ownership of Canadian enterprises, shift of trade from the United States to the Commonwealth, and an increase in interprovincial trade. In this way, changing the historical pattern of the commerce of convenience. Diefenbaker sought to divert as much as 15% of Canadian trade to the Commonwealth. It came to naught. The Liberals returned to government in a series of minority governments in the 1960s. This was a particularly productive time for Canada-US economic relations. Realizing that in at least one sector of the economy, geography really was destiny, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson and President Lyndon Johnson launched the Canada-US Auto Pact to create a unified North American auto market. The two countries removed tariffs on vehicles and parts traded between them. Between 1966 and 1977, trade in autos and auto parts grew tenfold. The auto industry became Canada's largest export industry. Just about then, stagflation hit North America. As gas lines extended, inflation ran rampant, unemployment exploded, and civil institutions in the United States looked close to implosion under the weight of Watergate and Vietnam. The new Liberal government under Pierre Trudeau sought a new approach. The third option, it was called, would diversify Canada's trade, economic and cultural relations away from the United States. After 1867, after 1911, after 1957, this was economic nationalism 4.0, or perhaps the beta version in a 100-year loop. Throughout the 1970s, Canadian exports to the US never dropped below 65%. By the early 1980s, they were held steady at over 70%. Was geography destiny? The Royal Commission on the Economic Union and Development Prospects for Canada, established by Trudeau in 1982 to investigate the Canadian economy, certainly thought so. The Commission issued its report in 1985 for the new Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. It rejected the third option and recommended the promotion of tighter integration with the United States, rejecting, again, the third option. This is what it said. Geography, combined with similar cultural and ethical backgrounds, have given rise to an interrelationship between the Canadian and US economies. Canada's economic well-being thus depends substantially on our relations with the United States. If until the 1980s we had stumbled into economic dependence in a fit of absent-mindedness, this was deliberate hitching of our fortunes to that of our American cousins. Now, Royal Commission reports do not end up in single-issue elections and transformational policies just like that. Integrationism was helped along by other facts. The 1984 election was transformational. For all the animosity between Trudeau père and both Nixon and Reagan, here was Mulroney singing When Irish Eyes Are Smiling on a stage with Ronald and Nancy. So the baseline was moved. Not that the personal relationship helped avoid trade disputes. My first memory of a trade issue was shakes and shingles. I found the title funny and was infuriated with the retaliatory tariffs we imposed on books. To be fair, I was 19 and prone to passionate intensity. Be that as it may, here was the issue. President Reagan implemented a 5-year program of tariffs on red cedar shakes and shingles, beginning at 35%. So we retaliated. And then there were additional tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, so we retaliated even more. And then those tariffs ended up hurting us, so of course we removed the retaliatory tariffs. Trade history is a cycle of farce on endless repeat. So if you want to know the why and the wherefore of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and the 1988 election, that's it, shakes and shingles. That led to the NAFTA, and before you know it, by the 2010s, some 80% of Canadian trade was with the United States. Whither the third option?
The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement, touched on by Rambod, evolved into the North American Free Trade Agreement. This agreement, which came into force in 1994, created the world's largest free trade area. Canada, all three members of the NAFTA for that matter, enjoyed preferential tariffs relative to other countries. NAFTA strengthened the rules and procedures that govern trade amongst the three nations, fostering a foundation for the Canadian economy to grow into what we know it to be today. Now the question then becomes, why? Why would Canada enter into the NAFTA when it already had negotiated a free trade agreement with the United States? The answer essentially begins and ends with preference erosion. Canada did not want to see nor reap the consequences of a fair trade agreement between the United States and another country, in this case, Mexico. Preference erosion refers to the reduction of a competitive advantage enjoyed by a country due to preferential trade treatment. Economists have described this phenomenon as the hub and spoke model. In this case, the US would be the hub, with Mexico and Canada being spokes to the US hub. The most attractive trading partner in this model would be the US, as they would have a preferential trading relationship with both Mexico and Canada, while Canada, for example, would only have a preferential relationship with the US. This issue has re-emerged in the context of the USMCA review, where President Trump has suggested that perhaps USMCA might be replaced with two bilateral agreements. Getting back to NAFTA, Canada and the Mulroney government were not the most interested in exploring a free trade agreement with Mexico, but gently, they were reluctant to give up their preferential access to the world's largest trading market. However, when it became clear that the deal would likely happen with or without Canada, well, the country was all in. The Mulroney government eventually decided it was better to be part of the negotiations than sit idly by and watch trade and investment be diverted away from Canada. So, with NAFTA at the forefront, what was going on in the global background? Well, as we heard, in 1995, and shortly after the enactment of NAFTA, the World Trade Organization was established. Notably, the WTO continues to be the only international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. The WTO established core governing principles. These principles include trading without discrimination, freer trade by lowering barriers, binding rules and commitments, transparency, and encouraging development and economic reform. The WTO is meant to foster and promote fair competition. For example, a notable inclusion in the establishment of the WTO was the reduction of the most favored nation tariffs. Under WTO rules, if a country reduces its most favored nation tariff for one member or country, it must do the same for all other members. As we've heard from one of our terrific guests, Valerie Hughes, the WTO still serves an essential and necessary purpose in the prosperity of world trade. But now what? Canada has just reestablished free trade relations with the biggest market in the world. Well, what's better than one free trade agreement? Two free trade agreements. The momentum gained from the NAFTA negotiations catapulted Canada into a new era, the free trade agreement era. Not long after the NAFTA in 1994, Canada had negotiated and signed multiple new agreements. To name a few, these include the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in 1997. This would be Canada's first free trade agreement outside of the Western Hemisphere. The Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in 1997. This would be Canada's first free trade agreement partner in Latin America, other than Mexico. The Canada-European Free Trade Association Agreement, which came into force in 2009 and includes the countries of Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. The Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in 2015, and as of 2024, 99% of Canada's exports are eligible for duty-free access into Korea. The list goes on, but hopefully this provides a quick snapshot of the post-NAFTA landscape in the country. Though not all of these negotiations were good for good times. As we discuss the successes of free trade agreements, we must also touch upon some of the failures. The free trade area of the Americas aimed to create the largest free trade area in the world. It would have encompassed all countries in the Western Hemisphere, excluding Cuba, catering to a population of approximately 800 million people. In 1994, leaders of these countries gathered for the Summit of the Americas. President Clinton was poised to establish this historic agreement by 2005. These negotiations were divided into different negotiating groups. Some notable groups include a market access group, an IP group, a group on subsidies, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and a dispute settlement group. The negotiations took part under a structured approach, and the agreement was to be implemented no later than December of 2005. The agreement stalled and ultimately failed. A large roadblock in the negotiations was the disapproval from Latin American countries towards the United States government's desire to include domestic subsidies into the agreement. The terms and scope of the agreement ultimately proved to be impossible to reconcile. Next up, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and however, this one comes with a happy ending. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a proposed trade agreement between 12 countries, including Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The TPP began as an expansion of the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement, which was negotiated between Chile, Brunei, Singapore, and New Zealand. Additional countries agreed to join negotiations in an effort to broaden the agreement. The TPP contained measures to lower both non-tariff and tariff barriers to trade, while establishing an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. The agreement was signed and en route to ratification until President Trump and the United States had other ideas. Prior to his election, he argued the agreement would undermine the U.S. economy and its independence. Upon his election on January 23, 2017, the United States had withdrawn from the agreement. So, rather than deciding to use this as an excuse to forgo the agreement's ratification, several signatories decided that they instead intend to rework the agreement without the participation of the United States. And this brings us to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. This free trade agreement encompasses 11 countries and is currently the trading bloc of 580 million consumers and 15.6% of global GDP. It importantly provides Canada with preferential access to key markets in Asia and Latin America. We then shift our focus to Europe and the European Union. The Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement is a progressive trade agreement between the EU and Canada. It was provisionally entered into force in 2017, and as we still await the national ratification process to take place by 10 EU member states. But in the meantime, 98% of duties on all tariff lines have been eliminated. As of 2021, Canada-EU trade grew enormously compared to its pre-CETA indicators. For example, exports in 2021 to the EU reached $32.5 billion, a 46.4% increase from 2016. Duty savings totaled over $890 million during that span. The EU's annual imports alone are worth more than Canada's GDP, and this agreement has opened up new options and a new competitive advantage for a country in a global context. Finally, Canada has long been involved strategically with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Since 1977, Canada has worked with these nations on political and security issues, regional integration, economic interests, transnational crime, and disaster risk reduction. More recently, however, Canada took a bigger step forward, solidifying its dedication to fostering this relationship. In 2023, the ASEAN-Canada Strategic Partnership was launched. Canada is facilitating increased cooperation in political, security, economic, and social cultural areas. Of course, the prospect of a free trade agreement has been floated around as well. In November of 2021, Canada and the ASEAN agreed to negotiate an ASEAN-Canada free trade agreement. Chief negotiators have met multiple times since November 2021, most recently in May of 2025. The parties continue to prioritize concluding these negotiations as soon as possible. In the meantime, last month, Canada signed a free trade agreement with Indonesia. What's next may remain to be seen, but as we heard from John Weeks, there is no replacing the United States economically or geographically. With the CUSMA review looming, all Canada can do is wait, rounding out the edges, one more free trade agreement at a time.
The Honourable Sergio Marchi has had an amazing career. After serving as an MP during the Mulroney era and fighting the good fight of the free trade election, he became Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, and then Minister of Environment, and finally Minister of International Trade under Prime Minister Chrétien. He was then named ambassador to the WTO. I had the great honor of working for him in different capacities and working on files that he had oversight for as Minister of Environment in the 1990s. We're fortunate to have him with us to talk the third option. Thank you so much, Sergio. I know it's late where you are. It's really good to see you after such a long time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sergio, you've just published a book about, it's called Pursuing a Public Life, How to Succeed in the Political Arena. And of course, your successes came after the Liberals did not succeed in two series of elections, 84 and 88. You were elected, but especially in 1988, the Liberals under John Turner failed to stop the free trade agreement with the United States. The end result was, of course, one could argue 2 decades of relative peace, but at the same time, that came at an enormous cost. That is to say, as I mentioned, we ended up with 80% export dependence on the United States market. So let me lob a softball at you. Was the U.S. Free Trade Agreement, in retrospect, a bad thing? Were you right in 1988?
No, I don't think so. I think, John Turner, as you mentioned, was very, very passionately opposed to the free trade proposal. And as you will recall, the 1988 election was essentially a referendum on entering a trade agreement with the United States. There were no other issues that came close, and that's why it was almost like a referendum. And at one point, it looked like John was going to win. The tide was turning, and then Mr. Mulroney emptied the bank on ads, both in radio, television, newsprint, and gathered the corporate community, and they overtook John. But I think when you look back, I've freely admitted that a number of us were concerned with John's position. That is to say, many of us were free traders. Many of us believed also in the constitutional architecture of Pierre Trudeau. So the trade and constitutional issues really ripped the caucus and the party apart. But on the election front for the trade agreement, a lot of us kind of held our noses and on we went. But I think it was a good deal. I think the numbers prove it. It was not a perfect deal. I don't think a perfect deal exists, but it was a great deal with the superpower of our era, the largest economy, and it was next door. So when people talk about diversification, governments, and you've mentioned Trudeau's third option, have tried to diversify. But it's a bit like going against the water flow, because if any other country occupied the real estate space that Canada does, I think their business community would have done the same thing. In other words, if they were to contemplate exporting their products and services, why would they not want to dip their first toes in American waters, since it's close, since it's the largest, most lucrative market, since our cultures are more similar, since they speak English? It was a no-brainer. So while governments try to urge businesses to diversify, the companies were doing well in America. And so why go to Indonesia when you can sell in Idaho? And so it's easy to say now we've made a mistake, but I think it was a natural inclination of the business community. Now the issue is obviously shifting, and now we must diversify if we are to survive the Donald Trump earthquake. So I think the trade deal was the right one. I think the integration economically helped our country. The reality is, who saw Donald Trump coming for a second time and being uncorked on so many different fronts?
So that makes perfect sense. And when you look at a map, there's Canada like we're attached to one country surrounded by water. And it's certainly, when you think about some of the commodities that we are selling, they're not necessarily easily transportable. So oil, gas, the auto sector. Some of these things are either difficult to transport or extremely heavy. But when we do think about a third option or entering other markets, are there any sectors that you think would be winners for Canada? Like if we're thinking about in the CETA context, or for example, you had mentioned Indonesia and how this is a NAFTA is far more valuable, or CUSMA than in Indonesia. But what are some of the opportunities? What should Canadian firms, or what should the Canadian government be doing to encourage Canadian firms to export? What should be exploited?
Yeah. Let me throw out a number of points that came to my mind before this interview, and then we can delve into them as you wish. The first is that our public diplomacy forever and a day between both liberal and conservative governments has been the balanced advocacy of both interests and values, so that when we export, we're not only exporting our goods, but we're also exporting the values that lie behind them. And I'm not suggesting that we sell our soul, but I think Canadians now have an expectations with the economic crisis from our largest trading partner that we now need to accentuate on interests and perhaps less so on values. In other words, Canadians expect their governments to collaborate and to be much more pragmatic when it comes to trade and investment. Secondly, that will mean that for all ambassadors and all embassies, and of course our team of trade commissioners, job priority one should be trade and investment opportunities. Again, you don't have to forget about everything else, but you need to know which side of the bread the butter is on at this point in our history. Thirdly, I wouldn't recreate doing a whole bunch of new trade deals. We can and we should, but initially, as you guys noted, we had some 15 free trade agreements with countries that number 51 countries, 60% of GDP, and are in a market of $1.5 billion. And so these are underutilized because, as Rambod and Stephen were saying, despite these 15 FTAs, we still overwhelmingly export and import with the United States. So I think we need to utilize these FTAs that we've already negotiated. Let business know of these, let them know what the export markets look like, talk about the cultures in these countries, and begin to take advantage of them, including settling the European Accord, where 10 countries have still to endorse the protocol. Fourthly, I think internal free trade must go from words to deeds. I think it's a no-brainer, and Trump may be the instigator in finally freeing up our own Canadian economy, which I think would be significant if the barriers come off. Fifthly, I would, if I was Carney, appoint a minister for foreign investment, inward bound, because right now foreign investment lies between a number of different ministries. But because of the crisis, I would centralize it. I would make it more focused. I would make it more strategic. I would have one minister and their department be the global envoy for chasing and hopefully getting foreign investment into Canada. And finally, I think it's time to revitalize and bring back the Team Canada missions that were pioneered by Jean Chrétien, when he would take all the premiers, the trade ministers, and hundreds of business leaders to a different part of the world for 10 days of the year. And not only did that open important doors because all the senior mandarins and politicians had a command performance when you have the president or premier of China asking you to, but it was also good for collaboration between the premiers and the prime minister, something we desperately need today with this crisis. Because Jean Chrétien used to say that the 10 best days of federal-provincial relations were happening when the Team Canada was working abroad, because the leaders would share buses, they would share meals, they would share meetings and ceremonies. And not only did they work on trade and investment promotion, but they actually discussed and worked on domestic issues back home. So I think there's a number of things that we can do, but I think there needs to be a shift from values to interests in a very pragmatic way. Carney talks about it as a hinge moment, which it is, but we've now got to translate those words into actions, and it's not going to be easy because it's going to take time. Nothing gets done overnight. So there'll be short-term pain as a result of our friend Donald Trump, but I think this might shake us out of our complacency for a long-term sustainable economy, which relies less on the United States. I agree it's tough to replace the United States, but at the same time, Carney is right when he says the old relationship we had is gone. And it really doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or someone else, because everyone around the world is now taking their own actions because they don't trust the American administration and they're not sure what's going to come after. So people and countries and companies are already factoring in their decisions, and there's no going back.
A lot of food for thought there in the 6 points that you raised. Let me pick on a couple of for elaboration. Let me start with your idea of a minister of inward investment. Makes a lot of sense, and there is in fact we have investment review and some investment responsibilities at Industry Canada. Then, of course, the Trade Commissioner Service itself is engaged in raising awareness about Canadian possibilities. But to go back what Stephen said at during the opening, investment in inward investment is spurred on in parts by access to the Canadian market itself, but we're a small market. A lot of that was, and this was the whole hub and spoke concern that that spurred us to try to accede to the NAFTA and eventually succeeded in doing that. We basically presented ourselves, and we continue to present ourselves as a gateway to the rich U.S. market. So in this context, if that U.S. market is either closed or uncertain, what is the selling point of a minister of investment, if not access to other markets, the third markets, the markets of the 15 countries with which we have a free trade agreement, and or the 15 free trade agreements we've got, and then any other free trade agreements that we open up.
Mm-hmm. No, there's no question that part of the strategy of Trump in hitting us and other countries with tariffs is his belief that this will increase investment to the United States. In other words, if companies in Canada are going to suffer as a result of the tariffs, then what he says in broad daylight is, well, then move to the United States. I call it an America only, because he can't care less if firms drop out of Canada or Africa or Europe or Asia to the United States. That's what he wants to do. So I get your point, but I just don't buy into, notwithstanding that gateway that is being undermined by Trump's actions. I just don't support chasing investment across a number of different portfolios. I think we need to be much more strategic. I think we must be more focused, more aggressive, and even if Trump would rather prefer that the government of Canada deal with investment through a central prism as opposed to 2 or 3 or 4 different locations with things falling between the cracks. So irrespective of the gateway, I just think it makes much more sense that a minister or department knows the business of where those investments are, go there, become a global envoy, system. Of course, the gateway concept was a great PR, or more than PR, a substantive element of that attraction for investment. But hopefully, once Trump is gone, we might not get another Trump-alike. We might go back to some more "quote unquote" normal times. At which case, I think that would become increasingly important. So I'm talking more about the process for how we get investment as opposed to the gateway, which obviously is a little bit outside of our control, given the unpredictability that Trump has injected into our global trade and investment.
Going back to the 6 points, which were very, very helpful. Grosso modo, as I understood what you were saying with respect to trade agreements, was rather than, in the short term at least, rather than spend time trying to negotiate new agreements, let's really activate and make the current agreements work. Let's sell them. Let's make sure Canadian business are taking advantage of them. But in that context, is there any merit or any of those agreements that could stand a bit of a refresh so that we could further integrate, or certain elements that could be added that would be useful to Canadian business? And there's a second part to my question, which is, even if we agree that we should, concentrate on trying to make these agreements work for maximum benefit of Canadian business, we do have other things that are happening and burbling, perhaps in the background, but they will come to the fore. So, for example, the EU is talking about a stronger relationship with CPTPP. And how should Canada view that type of a development, particularly in the context of the 6 points that you've raised?
Yeah. No, I think, Stephen, I was making the point of saying, look, there's a reason that we created 15 free trade agreements with up to 51 countries, representing 60% of the global GDP and a person market of 1.5 billion people. There's a reason we chose those 15 free trade agreements. And there's a reason why they're still not working as well. And that's because business has continued to go to make its gold brick in America. And I get it. Well, gold making in America is coming to an abrupt end. It's not an end, a difficult road because of what Mr. Trump has done. So rather than recreating the wheel, even though I think, like in the case of Indonesia, or in the case that you pointed out, that you can bring new bells and whistles into the agreement, of course, but it seems to me that conceptually, we need to re-educate Canadian business on the agreements that we have, on the advantages that they present to us, on what the key elements of products and services for each of these FTAs are, and get them to reorient. In other words, if the business in the United States is not going to be as lucrative, then it seems to me that those 15 free trade agreements right off the bat provide part of a solution. And so we got to take the horse to water. It's been difficult before to get the horse to drink non-American water. I get that, and we just went through why. But now the United States is no longer going to be considered trustworthy under Trump, or a friend, or an ally. And therefore, I think we need to make moves towards those 15 free trade agreements, and of course, add new ones as we can. But it seems to me that it would buy us a lot of time if we concentrated in bringing those companies to those FTAs, and then adding the bells and whistles as we see fit, which includes also the 10 countries that have still not ratified the European-Canada Trade Accord. So I didn't say that we just should stop at the 15. I'm just saying that the 15 represent an opportunity, an immediate opportunity of access. Let's use it. Let's bring business to the fore, and let's make sure they understand that we've got a few other doors to knock on.
So a CPTPP Team Canada.
Exactly.
Speaking of new bonds, I don't know if you were aware of my existence back in the Brazil-Canada dispute days, but that was my biggest file.
So it was your fault.
We did win some of it at least.
I remember them well from my WTO days. It seemed that every week I was bumping into Chelsea Amarin, the trade ambassador for
Absolutely.
Brazil, over planes and Embraer and our good guys. Yeah, difficult fun.
So here's a thought. In terms of and I know your interest in the region. In terms of new potentially new agreements, new areas to explore. We know that the EU and Mercosur have finally agreed to a new agreement, a free trade agreement, after some 25 years of negotiations. We have been negotiating on and off. It hasn't gone anywhere. So what do you think about a Canada-Mercosur free trade agreement? Should we bother? Is it worth the effort? Does it have strategic value above and beyond the monetary value? Is there, in your view, a market in Brazil that we could exploit that we have not?
Yeah. Well, I think my personal opinion is Brazil has always been a difficult trade partner. I can say that quite openly, quite frankly. I would have probably even said it had I still been wearing my WTO hat. Brazil, I found quite indignant, quite arrogant about its position. Brazil has always played like they are the America in the Americas, and there's other countries who despise that. So I'm not surprised that it took Europe almost 25 years of talking and badgering to get to first base. Should we be doing that? I wouldn't hope that we spent 25 years chasing Brazil and the other countries. But I do recognize that our minister was there recently. He was in Brazil trying to get the Mercosur-Canada relationship perhaps not back on track, but on track. So should we take a look at it? Yeah. Would I bet the farm on it? No. And when we talk about new quote unquote trade deals, we should also be mindful of not old deals, but countries like China that I think are hugely, hugely important. And the Chinese-Canada relationship has been in the deep freeze for a long time. I think Justin Trudeau had an incredible opportunity when the Chinese invited him days after he was elected prime minister to visit China, which meant that they were looking forward to the Trudeau era after Stephen Harper basically ignored China because he would throw red meat to his right-wing cabal in caucus, which in part was China. And also on the part of Justin Trudeau's father, who was revered right until the end. He was always treated as a prime minister when he went to China rather, since he, opened diplomatic relations either for America back in 1971. And I know that China is not everybody's cup of tea, and I know that people have many complaints about what China means today as opposed to years ago. But I don't think we can ignore China. I don't think we can isolate China. And that's why I think Carney would be smart in, as he has been, in pursuing a new interest in China, as well as a new interest in India. And these are some pretty sizable entities. And we can chase Mercosur for 25 years, or we can take a couple of years to get China and India right. If you ask me which one, I think it's an obvious selection. But we have to now accentuate a Chinese India collaboration like never before. Again, both files tricky, but again, you're not going to be able to isolate either Canada or China, and we'd be done if we tried to.
One of the things that there was a lot of discussion, I think, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Behboodi talking about the spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements, and the WTO was supposed to resolve or attempt to resolve that. Canada then went off and negotiated a series of free trade agreements, and that work is continuing by others. So we just talked about the EU Mercosur agreement, interest in others joining CPTPP. How much of that do you think is a problem, and how much of that is going to be a problem for Canadian business trying to diversify?
Yeah, I think for so many years, the cornerstone of our global trade policy was anchored in the WTO for a good reason. I mean, that's where the rules were made. That's where there was a rule of law that we Canadians subscribed to. And while we didn't win every one of our cases, we won a lot more than we lost. And a country of the size of Canada would always do much better in a World Trade Organization rather than the old rules of the Wild West, where the biggest and the most powerful control things. But I'm worried about the WTO, as I hope you are as well, because it hasn't been working. The Doha development is still outside after all these years. The WTO has lost relevance. The United States, which used to be the locomotive that pulled all the other countries for the most part, has now become a caboose. So it's part of the problem. And so if the U.S. is not leading the WTO forward, who is stepping into the breach? And right now, I can't see anybody stepping into it, or if those who have tried have failed. So the WTO is now in a weakened state, and you've got a guy in the White House who actually espoused getting rid of the World Trade Organization. So I'm not sure, as long as Trump is there, that the WTO is going to provide the kind of leadership that traditionally we would have wanted and hoped for. I'm not advocating that we get rid of the WTO, but I don't think that's going to be our answer during this tricky time. I think we have to take it upon ourselves and resolve it for ourselves, and perhaps the WTO can march forward under better times. Because right now, the WTO, I'm afraid to say, is like a stationary bicycle, right? Lots of ambassadors spinning wheels, sweating, losing weight, but for what? It hasn't moved forward. So when I was there, I was excited to be there because the WTO, since the Second World War, contributed a hell of a lot of economic prosperity and predictability and certainty. But right now, it's in a bad place. And part it's in a bad place because trade has shifted. When I was trade minister, I always viewed the trade portfolio as one of the best cabinet positions to be had, because it was largely a positive file. You were helping business sell our products and services around the globe. We were bringing down trade barriers and opening up new relationships with peoples and countries around the globe. And today, the WTO is showing a totally different image, in part because the political leaders have moved away from the WTO and trade. Many leaders join a parade against the WTO because they kind of put their finger up in the air and figure out which way the wind is blowing. So you don't have leaders who are courageous. You've got leaders who are blaming trade for their economic job losses. You've got people saying that you know, the WTO is too bureaucratic or that the United States controlled it too much. All I know is that the WTO and its predecessor did a lot of positive good for countries like Canada and the globe. But right now, the WTO is somewhat paralyzed, and it's paralyzed because there hasn't been political leadership and political courage to continue what, ironically, America and most of the West did after the Second World War, which was to revamp how we did trade and its rules and its how we deal with products. So for me, the WTO in the short term is not the answer. I'm hoping that it can come back in the long term, but right now, I think we march to a different drummer.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our session today. Stephen and I would like to thank Sergio Marchi for being with us. As well, a project of this kind requires a lot of work to bring together. In particular, honorable mention is reserved for Alex Zutis, articling student, and our producer, Jason Chute, and of course, the entire technical staff of BLG. Thanks again, Sergio and Stephen. This is the end of this session.
Thank you, Sergio. Great to
Rambod,
see you.
Stephen, it's a pleasure, and let's keep hope alive.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.